In this more abstract episode, a precursor to a dialogue I plan to bring you later, for some inexplicable reason I forewent the fireside chair and chose the dining table. Onward. This is not even close to telling the story of the first time we've witnessed unlikely and indeed uneasy alliances between influential factions within our societies. Often such groups have long existed in tense proximity, or perhaps historically in outright conflict. But we live now more than a decade, nearly two in fact, since public attention peaked via acclaim from many and derision from others for those well-known men and women not of God, who harnessed new online methods of broadcast and emerging social media as a way to bolster their existing traditional communication methods, namely writing and lecturing. Whether granted membership of the vaunted quartet of horsemen atheists, or merely the wider grouping of so-called new atheists, there was undeniably an identity formed. This is for another discussion, but they did not create such labels for themselves, especially those four horsemen, and each man barely recognised the various social media amplified tags. A handful wanted membership, somewhat needily it has to be said, and so perpetuated the apparent coordination of a brother and sisterhood, which in reality was merely the result of a handful of popular, in hindsight televised events, conversations and friendships. Public discourse certainly appeared to favour the new atheists in the years following the global infection of religious terrorism stoked by fundamentalist Islamic clerics. It was rationalism, democracy and science versus the murderous medieval jihadists. At face value, a simple combat between right and wrong. I'm hardly to claim that the other key demographic groups were silent or distracted. Leaders within the two other faiths of Abraham took their own action, and it's undeniable many Western service people in the Middle Eastern wars saw themselves as representative warriors of Christianity, or in rarer cases, of Judaism. Other important faiths, Hinduism for example, held seats at influential institutions. But now, with at least some clarity afforded by hindsight of the 2000s and 2010s, it's my view that Christians and Jews lacked a coherent message, let alone a potent strategy in the face of Islamic violence. Especially those Christian or Jewish subgroups they or we may consider moderate, and I must quote-unquote that word as I'm sceptical of its validity in the context of any religion and want to expand on why another day. Into the late 2010s and the 2020s, with profound cultural and rhetorical changes taking place across the West, there's undeniably this new observation of mine to be made. By the way, yes, I am focusing on the West here, but I'm not glossing over the other major global changes: collapsing birth rates in the Far East, China's uneasy capitalist pseudo-communism and stealth colonization of Africa, sub-Saharan African population explosions. There are many more. But back to my observation in the West. Most prominently amongst public figures, be they unofficial or official, but trickling down into the populace, we see explicit cooperation between fundamentally incompatible faiths and also of the faithless. Jews and Christians, atheists with both of the aforementioned, Hindus and Christians. Now, of course, not everyone and everywhere, but anyone paying attention must have noticed apparently authentic friendships and messages of solidarity promulgating from where they did not before. And not just from those merely nominally of faith or none, but those vehemently so. To caveat, naturally you will always notice the loudest people, and so the spokespeople, the famous artists, the writers, the political, the podcasters. It is they who we hear from most. But this is far from a red herring. These people do lead, whether you like it or not. Given their growing influence, it's not lazy nor ignorant to mention these high-profile individuals who operate online before vast audiences and do so explicitly across discussions of faith, lack of faith, religion, and ethnicity. Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Bill Maher, Alex O'Connor, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. Some came to fame as New Atheism was selling millions of books, yet others were barely born then. Now, not all are friends, but many in that loose network of commentators, journalists, activists and scientists are, or at least they discuss matters civilly, but often with more closeness than with a bare minimum. I'd argue with an implicit or explicit hope of forming a coalition against the elephant in the room. So one question we need ask is of the purpose of allying with someone with whom you share fairly little, often not even the fundamentals. Fear of a common existential enemy? Commercial alliances to combine and cross-pollinate online audiences? Are some branches of faiths flexible and undevout enough to not really care if another's contradicts their own foundation so long as they agree on day-to-day matters? Consider these motivations against the backdrop of what these groups, let's say the Christians, the Jews and the atheists, traditionally thought the others had committed by association as collective crimes. Historically and theologically questionable, of course, but Christians thought, and some think, that Jews were complicit in the torture and murder of God. That's hard to brush aside. At best, that Jews reject Jesus of Nazareth's divinity. Jews, of course, reject the sacred nature of the books of the New Testament, and so given the depth of many of their faith, consider Christians beyond reproach for their veneration of that text. Those adhering to the first and second key religions faithful to the first prophet, Abraham, so collectively deemed Judeo-Christians, an interesting clubbing together in itself, have of course felt dismay or disgust towards secularists and those rejecting outright the truth and profundity of any deity, let alone their own. Atheists, considering themselves intellectual descendants of the Enlightenment, typically do so on scientific grounds, and specifically due to the requirement for evidence to satisfy the self-evidently fruitful scientific method. And atheists and anti-theists, of course by the same token in reverse, look at those with evidence-free belief in supernatural creators and invigilators as backward, intellectually deficient, or tragically brainwashed. How these differences can reconcile is puzzling. As I mentioned, it's possible that some people are simply not that deeply invested in the faith or principles, and are more easily swayed by the pressures of daily life and the temptations of political prudence than they would admit. Others are devout, yet feel an affinity for those similar but different faiths, and blame the schisms on the mortal, undivine humans who misinterpreted their God's intention, and so are to blame for the often violent mess they and we ended up in. The willingness to befriend, share platforms and strategize across the I believe, I do not believe divide is a great deal tougher. It's hard to identify a bigger difference in how the fundamentals of how two brains operate than the willingness of one to commit their lives to the worship of an unverifiable creator and of the other to believe only what they can see, touch and interact with. But there is always hope. Hope to persuade the other as to your way of seeing things. And if they are willing to talk, for the time being without the threat to kill you and destroy all you hold dear, that hope is far easier to understand. And so I think we have an answer in part to why our current decade sees a coherent and widespread alliance between, in particular, the three groupings of Jew, Christian and atheist. Driven by admirably in-depth and long-form good faith discussion on both page and screen, and time to absorb what Al-Qaeda, ISIS and their ilk really did, what they wanted and what their regenerations still seek, I am convinced that an alliance will persist into the medium term. Despite the contradictions within that coalition being impossible to discuss away, that truce of necessity is born of righteous outrage and fear, and then a realization that something must be done.